That was my truth. My name is Rachel Bennett, and for the first 22 years of my life, I believed I was simply born wrong. Too quiet, too sensitive, too unlike the rest of them. In a family full of shining stars, I was the flickering candle no one bothered to light. My voice was soft, my dreams quieter, and my presence barely noticeable. At the family dinner table, the noise was always overwhelming. Laughter, stories, jokes, and side conversations. And yet, none of those voices ever turned in my direction. I'd speak, but my words were often interrupted, dismissed, or worse, ignored completely. I became skilled at pretending I wasn't heard, at swallowing the ache that built up in my throat every time someone said, "Oh, sorry, Rachel. Were you saying something?" I remember birthdays where the cake had my name, but none of my favorite flavors. Where gifts were bought last minute, tags from clearance racks still hanging. Where my siblings unwrapped thoughtful, personalized surprises, and I smiled over a t-shirt 2 sizes too big. It wasn't hate. It was indifference. And somehow that hurt more. My father, Richard Bennett, a proud, booming man with silver hair and sharp business instincts, always admired boldness. My siblings, Olivia and Eric, inherited that boldness like a birthright. Olivia was a track star with trophies decorating every shelf. Eric, the golden boy, breezed into Ivy League with a football scholarship and charm that could sell sunshine in the desert. And me? I wrote poetry in a journal I never showed anyone. I read books under the covers at night and imagined worlds where I belonged, where someone waited for me to speak before changing the subject. Mom said I was too emotional, like it was a bad habit I needed to break. "Rachel, sweetie, you need to toughen up," she'd say as I stood blinking back tears after being left out of yet another family trip because I probably wouldn't enjoy it anyway. I began to believe them. Maybe I really was too sensitive. Maybe I needed to change. So I tried. In high school, I joined clubs that didn't interest me. I laughed when I didn't find things funny. I dressed like Olivia, straightened my wild curls, and forced myself into conversations that felt like swimming upstream. I worked tirelessly to get straight as, thinking maybe they'd notice if I earned enough gold stars. They didn't. The one time I overheard Dad say my name, he was telling Olivia, "Rachel's, well, she's different. Don't worry about her." Different. That word echoed like thunder in my chest. They never asked why I was always alone, why I spent weekends in the library, or why my journals kept filling up faster than my phone's contact list. No one noticed when I cried in the car after family dinners. No one asked if I was okay when I started skipping meals or sleeping through entire weekends. And yet I wasn't angry. Not then. I just quietly disappeared. Even at Thanksgiving, when the whole extended family gathered in our big Vermont farmhouse, I was the one clearing dishes while everyone watched football. I learned to read lips from across the room, not because I needed to, but because no one invited me into the conversation. One year, I made my famous pumpkin cheesecake, the recipe I'd perfected after 10 failed tries. I placed it proudly on the table, waiting for someone to comment. They didn't even cut it. Olivia had brought cupcakes. Cupcakes. I watched silently as my cheesecake sat untouched all evening. After everyone left, I dumped it in the trash. That night, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, mascara smudged, hair tangled, and whispered to my reflection, "You don't matter here." But something inside me, some stubborn ember, refused to accept that as the end. The change didn't happen overnight. It started with a decision, a quiet one, like the ones I was used to making. But this time, it wasn't about shrinking. It was about surviving. I applied for out-of-state colleges, without telling anyone. I wrote an essay titled "The Art of Being Invisible," and it won a national competition. Still, no one in my house read it. When I got accepted to Columbia University, I placed the letter on the fridge, next to Olivia's marathon photo and Eric's football poster. It stayed there for 3 days before someone moved it to make room for a takeout menu. That was the last sign I needed. 2 months later, I left. No dramatic goodbye. No tearful send-off. Just a quiet drive with 2 suitcases and a heart full of broken glass. New York City was overwhelming, loud, fast, and ruthless. But strangely, I fit in more here than I ever did in my own home. I got a part-time job at a bookstore. I started journaling again, then moved to short stories and eventually essays. One night, on a whim, I submitted a personal piece to a new digital magazine, The Girl in the Silent Room. They published it. It went viral. Thousands of women wrote back, saying they had felt invisible too, that they cried reading my words, that they finally felt seen. I stared at those messages for hours. Total strangers, reading my truth, holding it with more care than my own blood had. For the first time in my life, I felt heard. More publications followed. Interviews, podcast features, a book offer. And then came the message that stopped my breath. It was from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. She said, "Your mom shared your article on Facebook. She said she's proud of her daughter, the writer." My heart nearly stopped.
Proud? Now they saw me?
That one sentence cracked open a well of emotions I hadn't touched in years. Grief, confusion, anger, and a strange sense of justice. I was no longer the girl clearing dishes in silence. I was Rachel Bennett, a name printed on book covers, a voice in rooms far louder than my family's living room. But still, the question burned inside me. Did I really need their recognition to feel whole? To understand how deep the ache of being unseen ran within me, you'd need to know more about the people who shared my house but never really shared their hearts. Let's start with my father, Richard Evans, a man who spoke more with his expectations than with his words. He ran a successful insurance firm downtown, wore suits even on Sundays, and believed that strength was measured in silence and accomplishment. He wasn't cruel, not in the ways you see in movies. He never yelled or raised a hand. But his absence, even when he was physically present, left bruises in places no one could see. He praised achievements, but only if they were the kind that earned medals or made money. He adored Daniel, his firstborn son, his mirror image. Daniel could do no wrong. Captain of the football team, homecoming king, full ride to Penn State. My dad talked about him as though he were a legend. And maybe to him he was. Then came Madison, the family's pride and joy. Artistic, magnetic, the kind of girl who floated through a room and collected admiration like pollen. She was popular in school, always had a trail of friends, and danced at the local studio 5 nights a week. She was the kind of daughter my mother, Lillian, could show off at brunches with the other neighborhood moms. Dresses that swayed like petals, piano recitals in perfectly curled hair, and a smile that seemed to reflect everyone's best hopes. And then there was me. I was none of those things. I was bookish, introverted, clumsy in heels, and prone to daydreaming in math class. I loved cloudy days, handwritten letters, old jazz records, and stories about lost girls who found their way. I liked being alone, not because I hated people, but because it was the only time I felt like I belonged. I often wondered if my mother ever really saw me. She wasn't unkind. In fact, she was warm, just not with me. She knew how to braid Madison's hair into perfect French twists, but always pulled mine too tight. She never asked me what I wanted for my birthday. I usually got what was left over after Madison had her pick, sometimes even her hand-me-downs wrapped in fresh paper. She once told me, "Rachel, you're too quiet. People won't know what to do with you." I think she believed it was advice. But to me, it felt like a warning, like a prophecy I was cursed to fulfill. In school, I wasn't bullied. I was tolerated. I wasn't invited to parties, but I wasn't picked last either. I floated through hallways like a ghost in jeans and cardigans, carrying my books close and my thoughts even closer. My teachers liked me, said I was thoughtful, imaginative, polite. But they never knew how often I cried in the bathroom stalls between periods, how often I imagined being someone else. Someone loud. Someone loved. There was one teacher, though, Mrs. Fields. My 10th grade English teacher. She was the first person who read one of my short stories and said, "Rachel, this is brilliant." I cried that day. Not in front of her, of course, but in the library afterward, behind the shelves of fiction. Because someone finally saw me. Not as Daniel's sister. Not as the quiet one.
but as someone who had something to say.
It changed everything. I started to write more. At night. In the early mornings. Between classes. Stories about girls who spoke when no one listened and still found a way to be heard. I filled notebooks, hundreds of pages, most of them hidden under my bed. When it was time for college applications, I knew what I wanted. I wanted to leave. Not just physically, but emotionally. I wanted to step out of the fog I'd lived in for years and breathe, really breathe, for the first time. But when I told my parents I wanted to study creative writing in Chicago, the silence was deafening. My father looked over his newspaper and said, "That's not a real degree." Madison laughed and said, "You? In Chicago? You'll be eaten alive." And my mother? She sighed, placed her coffee down, and said, "We can't afford that kind of dream right now. Why don't you apply somewhere closer? Maybe community college?" But Daniel had gotten a new car that year. Madison had flown to Paris on a school art trip. There was money, just not for me. So I applied in secret. I worked part-time at a local bookstore to save money for the application fees. I mailed the essays, printed them at the library, and held my breath for weeks. And when that acceptance letter came, I felt something I hadn't in years: hope. I left with 2 duffel bags and a dream stitched together with stubbornness and sorrow. No one drove me to the airport. No one sent a care package. But I didn't cry. Not then. Chicago was a shock to the system. The noise, the pace, the sheer anonymity of it all, it overwhelmed me. But it also freed me. I found solace in the quiet corners of cafes, in late-night writing workshops, in cheap secondhand books and warm, dusty libraries. I found people who didn't care about my last name, only about my voice. And slowly, I started to become someone new. Or maybe I was finally becoming me. I made a friend, Leah, a sarcastic, sharp-eyed girl from Brooklyn who wore combat boots and never let me apologize for existing. She said once, "You've got that soft armor, Rachel. People don't see it, but it's there. You survive like roots under winter."
She saw me.
Not the shadow of a girl I had been, but the writer, the thinker, the person I could be. And then came the day I share my story online. I didn't expect the world to care. I thought maybe a few readers would nod in understanding. But the world listened. Messages came in waves. People saying they felt invisible too. Saying they had sat at dinner tables where no one asked about their day. That they, too, had grown up in houses where love was measured in conditions and comparisons. I wasn't alone. My story became their mirror. That story led to others. And others. Soon, I was invited to speak at a reading event. Then another. Then a podcast. Then a publisher. Then my first book. It was titled Almost Seen. When it hit the shelves, I held it in my hands and cried. Not for the success, but for the girl I had once been, the one who used to cry behind bookshelves, who thought her voice didn't matter. She had made it. She had become someone. And as the world applauded, a strange silence returned to me. Not the painful kind I had known before. This was a silence of healing. A silence filled with understanding. But with every step I took forward, the shadows of my past stretched behind me. Until that phone call. The one for my parents. They had seen me, finally. But now I had to decide, was I ready to see them again? When I saw my father's name flash across the phone screen, I froze.
It had been 4 years since I'd left.
4 years of silence. 4 years of rebuilding myself, piece by piece, in a city that didn't know my scars or my shame. And now, out of nowhere, here they were, calling. I let it ring the first time. The second. The third. By the 5th call, my chest was tight.
What did they want? Why now?
They hadn't called when my article trended on the New York Times homepage. Not when my book became a bestseller. Not when I'd been invited to speak at TEDx. No, this wasn't pride. This was something else. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the decline button, when I noticed the message notification. It was from Madison. "Mom's not doing great. You should call." That was it. "No, hey. No, we miss you. Just a command, laced in guilt. And with that single sentence, a storm I'd buried deep in my soul began to stir. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk, watching the city lights flicker like stars trying to break through smog. I opened my old journals, the ones I wrote in back when I was still invisible, still aching for someone to look at me like I mattered. One entry stood out. Maybe one day, they'll see me. Maybe one day, I won't feel like a stranger in my own house. That day had come, but it felt hollow. What did it matter now that they saw me, when I had already learned to see myself? Still, something pulled at me. Not out of love. Not even out of curiosity. Out of unfinished business. So I called. The phone rang once.
Twice.
Then, hello? My father's voice was slower than I remembered. Older, as if time had worn him down.
Rachel, he said.
No emotion. Just my name. I waited. He didn't speak again. Hi, Dad. There was a pause. A long one. I could hear the hum of the kitchen light in the background, like I was back in that house again, waiting for someone to tell me I wasn't just furniture. Your mother's sick, he said finally. It's serious. Stage 3.
My throat went dry.
I wanted to ask 100 things. Why didn't you call sooner?
Why now? What do you want from me?
But all I could manage was, I'm sorry. She wants to see you, he added quickly. She's been talking about you. That struck me.
Why?
What could she possibly have to say after years of silence? Of choosing Madison every time? Of dismissing me like a seasonal inconvenience? I'm in the middle of a tour. I replied, my voice colder than I meant. I don't think I can get away right now. Silence again. Then a quiet, okay. No fight. No pleading. Just okay. I hung up.
And cried.
Not for her, but for the confused girl I used to be, who would have given anything for that one sentence. She's been talking about you. A week passed. I thought I could ignore it. But grief doesn't need permission. It creeps in through the smallest cracks, a song on the radio, the smell of lemon in a grocery aisle, an old voicemail you forgot to delete.
So I packed a small bag.
Just for the weekend, I told myself. One flight. One visit. One conversation. Closure. When I landed back in Atlanta, the air felt heavier. Warmer. Like it hadn't moved since I left. Everything was familiar, but nothing felt like home. My father picked me up. We didn't hug. The car ride was a silent film, just the occasional sound of blinkers and the soft tapping of his fingers against the steering wheel. We pulled up to the same white house, porch swing and all. But something was off. The flowers were overgrown. The shutters needed paint. The light in the front window didn't turn on. She's upstairs, my father said, as if that explained everything. I walked inside. Every creak in the wooden floor felt like an echo of the girl I used to be. I found Madison in the kitchen. Still perfect. Still polished.
She smiled, tight-lipped.
Hey, stranger. Hey. She poured me a glass of water and pushed it toward me like we were coworkers making small talk at lunch. She's been asking about you. So I heard. She might not look like you remember her. Just be ready. I walked upstairs, each step heavier than the last. I could hear the oxygen machine before I saw her. A slow, steady wheeze, like the house itself was exhaling. She lay in the bed, smaller than I remembered. Her face was pale, eyes closed, hair wrapped in a scarf. I stood there, not moving, not breathing. Then her eyes opened, and she smiled, like I'd just come back from war. Oh, Rachel, she whispered. You came. I sat down, unsure of what to do with my hands. My heart was tight. My mind was screaming. I didn't think you'd want to see me, I said, my voice shaking despite myself. She reached out, frail fingers brushing mine. I should have seen you sooner. I should have told you how proud I was. I read your book, you know. You did. I cried through half of it. That surprised me. But I didn't know if the tears were for me or for herself. I didn't write it for you. I know, she said softly. That's why it hurt so much. We sat in silence. Then she said something I'll never forget. I spent so much time trying to make you more like Madison. I didn't realize the world needed someone exactly like you. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest she'd ever come. The next 2 days were blurry. Madison and I danced around each other, exchanging polite updates, fake smiles, and unspoken tension. At night, I'd sit on the porch swing, journaling like I used to, but the words came slower now, because something inside me was shifting. Seeing my mother so weak, so human, cracked the armor I had built for years. One evening, Madison sat next to me on the swing. "She always loved you, you know." I scoffed. She had a funny way of showing it. "She was scared of you," Madison said. I turned. "What? You were everything she wasn't. You saw through people. You didn't try to fit in." She didn't know how to handle that. I stared into the distance. "She used to read your blog every week. She printed out your first short story and put it in her drawer. She just never knew how to say she was proud." I didn't know what to say. "She's dying, Rachel," Madison whispered. "Don't let the past take everything from you." That night, I went into my mother's room again. She was asleep, her breath shallow. I sat beside her and whispered, "I forgive you." The words didn't come easy, but they came. And in that moment, I felt something lift. Not because everything was okay, but because I no longer needed their approval to feel whole. I stood up to leave the room when I saw it. On her nightstand, a printed copy of my story, "The Girl They Forgot," highlighted, annotated, dog-eared, and right on the top, in her handwriting, "She thinks no one sees her." But I always did. I just didn't know how to show it. The morning she died was quiet. No grand storm. No cinematic farewell. Just stillness. Like the world held its breath for her exit. I had fallen asleep in the armchair beside her bed. The oxygen machine was still humming faintly when I opened my eyes. But she wasn't breathing anymore. She was gone. For a long time I just sat there, still like the girl I used to be. The invisible one. The one no one remembered. And yet, in that moment, I didn't feel forgotten. I felt seen. Because despite the years of silence, the wounds, the regrets, something had changed. Not just in her, but in me. I didn't cry right away. Grief, I was learning, doesn't always come in waves. Sometimes, it settles in the corners of your chest, quietly, like dust. The days that followed were a blur of casseroles, floral arrangements, and carefully whispered condolences. She was a lovely woman. She adored her children. She was so proud of Rachel. That last one felt strange on my ears. Me. The child she rarely looked at. The girl who waited in the shadows. Now, I was the daughter everyone wanted to talk to, the successful writer, the inspiration, the phoenix who rose. I was getting the attention I once longed for, and I didn't want it anymore. Because I wasn't that girl now. I wasn't empty. I had filled myself. The night before the funeral, I stood in the backyard under the same oak tree I used to hide beneath during family cookouts. The one where Daniel taught Madison how to throw a football, where Mom took their Polaroid pictures while I watched from the swing set. I lit a candle in her memory. Alone. As the flame flickered, I pulled out the note I'd found on her nightstand. The one with her handwriting that read, "She thinks no one sees her." But I always did. I traced her words with my fingertip. Was it too little too late? Maybe. But it was also real. I whispered into the wind, "I forgive you," then added, "And I forgive myself." Because for all the resentment I carried, I also bore guilt for not saying something sooner, for not showing up for myself louder, for not knowing that love can sometimes wear the ugliest masks. At the funeral, Madison gave the eulogy. Her voice cracked once, just once, when she said, "Mom was complicated, but she loved hard in the only way she knew." I watched our father from the front pew. He looked smaller than I remembered, not just physically, but in presence, like a balloon that had finally lost its air. After everyone left, I approached him. We stood in silence, just the two of us beside her gravestone. "I don't hate you," I said quietly. He looked startled. "I did, for a long time, but I don't anymore." He nodded. His eyes were glassy. I didn't know how to love you right. I know. And I'm sorry. That was it. Not a breakdown. Not a dramatic reunion. Just two people trying to understand each other after too much time had passed. And sometimes that's all we get. I returned to Chicago a week later. Back to my tiny apartment, my cluttered desk, my half-finished manuscripts. But I wasn't the same person who had left. The girl who needed to be seen had grown into a woman who now saw herself, clearly, unapologetically. And with that clarity came purpose. 2 months later, I stood on a stage at a women's conference in Boston. The auditorium was filled. Women of all ages, all races, all backgrounds. I took a breath, looked out over the sea of faces, and began. I was not one of them from my family. Not until they saw me. The words echoed through the microphone. I spent years shrinking myself to fit their silence. I thought if I was quiet enough, helpful enough, invisible enough one day, they'd look up and finally say, "There you are. We see you." But they didn't. Not until I stopped waiting. Not until I stood up and told the truth of who I was. And maybe that's the lesson, that some of us were never meant to blend in. Some of us were born to disrupt the silence. The applause came slowly at first, then louder, fiercer. But it wasn't the claps that moved me, it was the eyes. Tearful eyes, nodding heads, women mouthing thank you from the fifth row. After the talk, a girl no older than 20 came up to me. "I read your book," she said, clutching it to her chest like a lifeline. "I felt like you were writing about me." I smiled, tears in my own eyes. That's because I was. In some way, I think we're all her, the girl they forgot. But we don't have to stay forgotten. She hugged me tight. And for the first time in my life, I realized I was never invisible. I was just surrounded by people who refused to look. Back home, I framed the note my mother wrote, hung it near my desk. Beside it, I placed a photo of me, the little girl in overalls, standing behind Daniel and Madison at a school play. She's not smiling. But now I look at her and whisper, "I see you." And she smiles back. Have you ever stood in front of a mirror and not recognized the person staring back? Not because of age or stress or time, but because the person looking at you had been hiding for so long, even you forgot she existed? That used to be me. A girl buried under decades of almosts and not quite good enoughs. A woman built from silence, stitched together by the approval she never received, walking through life like a ghost hoping to be noticed. But here's what I've learned. You don't need permission to be whole. You don't need applause to exist. You don't need someone else to declare your worth for it to be true. I spent so many years waiting. Waiting to be chosen. Waiting to be celebrated. Waiting for someone in my family to finally turn around and say, "Rachel, we see you." And then one day, I stopped waiting. I picked up a pen. And in that moment, I chose myself. Dear reader, maybe your name isn't Rachel. Maybe your story doesn't include a mother who forgot to show up or siblings who never let you speak. Maybe your version of invisibility looks different. But I know this. Somewhere along the way, the world tried to convince you that your light was too dim to matter. Maybe they said you were too sensitive, too quiet, too loud, too much, not enough. Maybe you learned to lower your voice to make space for others. Maybe you stayed in rooms that made you feel smaller just so you wouldn't be alone. Maybe, like me, you mistook survival for belonging. But here's the truth they never told us. You belong here, exactly as you are. No shrinking required. To the women who were always told to be quiet, speak. To the girls who were taught to serve and never ask, demand. To the souls who were expected to blend in, rise up. There's a fierce kind of power that comes from choosing yourself after years of being overlooked. A power that doesn't scream or shout, but stands firm.
Steady. Whole.
You may think your story doesn't matter, but someone out there is waiting to hear it. Someone is standing on the same cliff you once stood on, wondering if they can fly. And your truth may be the wind beneath their wings. I don't write to be famous. I don't write to prove anything anymore. I write because there's a girl out there with ink-stained hands and a burning ache in her chest, just like I had, and she needs to know that she is not alone. She needs to know that being invisible doesn't mean being worthless. She needs to know that being forgotten isn't the end of her story. It's just the beginning of her return. The hardest part of healing is not forgiving others. It's learning to forgive yourself for believing the lies they made you live in. Lies like, you're too emotional. You're not like your sister. You should be more grateful. Lies that are passed down like heirlooms, wrapped in tradition and silence, delivered by the very hands that were supposed to protect us. But we get to break the cycle. We get to write new endings. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Start before they see you. Write before they read you. Speak before they listen. You don't need to be validated to begin. Your worth doesn't wait for applause. Your power doesn't ask for permission.
You are already enough.
You were born enough. You just forgot for a while. Now is the time to remember. Remember the girl who danced alone in her room and believed she was magic. Remember the woman who still flinches at praise because she doesn't trust it. Remember the stories you've buried under your ribs, hoping they'd be easier to carry if you never said them out loud. Now is the time to speak. Now is the time to rise. Now is the time to choose you. Because one day, someone will look back at your story and say, she made it possible for me to believe again. Not because you were perfect, but because you were real. And real is what saves us. So tell your story, even if your voice shakes, even if your hands tremble, even if no one claps. Because you don't need the whole world to listen. You just need to listen to yourself, to the part of you that's been waiting, quietly, patiently, whispering, I was never invisible. I was just waiting for me to see me.